I'm joined now by retired British Army officer Major General Tim Cross, and we're talking today, Tim, about a situation which seems to be spreading across several European countries where they're introducing some form, at the moment voluntary in most cases, of military service for youngsters. We saw just the other month France announcing 18 and 19-year-olds will be able to volunteer for a 10-month term of military training. Now Germany has said that all 18-year-olds will be sent a questionnaire asking if they are willing to join the armed forces, and from 2027, all 18-year-old men will have to undergo a medical to see if they will be fit to actually serve in the military. Do you think this all shows that the pendulum of how we actually create and maintain armed forces across Europe is swinging back from the professional elite army model back towards the mass conscription model?
Yeah, I think there's certainly evidence of that. I think historically, we, the UK, as well as these other European nations, had relatively small professional military and had large conscripted or capabilities of conscripting people. And then we, of course, had national service for a number of years till the early 1960s. So it's not unusual historically. I think lots of things have changed, but obviously the primary issue at the moment is the threat of Russia and the concern within Europe that, and I think, my own view is Putin's couldn't be less interested in peace in Ukraine at the moment. So people are worried about what's happening in Ukraine and worried about what could therefore happen subsequently, particularly the Baltic states and so on. And others like Poland are spending a lot of money. Poland's increasing its defence spending to about 5% of GDP. And countries like France and Germany, which had conscription historically, as indeed did others, I think are just saying we need to think about how we're going to expand our military to meet the threat. Always remembering that the most important part of defence in the round is that it is a deterrent to try to stop war, and therefore showing your potential enemy that you have the capability and the will to do something if something should break out. So it sends a message in and of itself if you then, open up things like conscription.
And of course, we're aware that there are negotiations going on over America's peace plan for Russia and Ukraine, and various players in that, including President Trump, including Putin, including Zelensky, with very different views on exactly who is ready for peace and who isn't. And of course, Putin has said that Ukraine could have peace tomorrow if they basically accepted all of Russia's demands. But is it fair to say that whatever nation we're living in, providing that deterrent and being able and willing to actually go to war if we have to is a costly business?
Yeah, I mean, it is. And historically, we, the UK, were spending well above 5% for quite a long time throughout the Cold War years, which didn't end until 1989. And then we took a huge peace dividend over the subsequent decades, really. But other nations did too. And of course, it's good. We're living in an era of peace, really. When you look back to through history, the long era of peace since World War II. Of course, there have been wars, but the numbers of wars have been relatively low, and the casualty rates have been relatively low historically. But we've lived through that period. And so for a generation that was born, I don't know, in the early 1980s. Who have the Cold War came to an end when they were under 10. For them, there's been no threat of war, and therefore the idea of serving in the military and spending money on the military has just not been top, the highest priority. So all the defence money all the money used to be spent on defence over the last decades has been moved towards welfare and NHS spending and so on. And I don't think there's any doubt that governments do realise they need to spend more money on defence, and it is an expensive business. Modern technology, modern weapon systems. We're talking about aeroplanes that cost the best part of £100 million a throw, and ships that are expensive. The carriers were in the billions. But the ability to shift your expenditure today is pretty difficult, actually, in the current climate, and we know that from the budget here in the UK. So yeah, we have. I don't want to be unfair to the current government, but we have a government that said they want to increase defence spending from 2.5 to 3, and then subsequently maybe to 3.5. But they're not talking about doing that to the mid 2030s. Well, the world will change a lot in the next 10 years. So it's not easy. But if you think there is a serious threat, and that's what you come down to at the end of the day, you have to assess what you think the threat is in terms of capability and intent. Is Russia seriously going to try and take on NATO? Is it seriously going to try and move into the Baltic states? Well, there are those who think that is a serious threat. And if you believe that to be the case, you've got to be prepared to put the resources into sending a message about deterrence and, if necessary, a capability of actually fighting.
Now, Germany has said that they're essentially trying to drum up volunteers to get some sort of military training and be ready to take on roles if they're needed. They've said if they don't get enough volunteers, they could consider some sort of compulsory national service or military service in the go forward. When it comes to the UK, do you think on the one hand, the potential threats from other nation states might increase people's willingness to step forward to defend their homeland, but on the other hand, it might actually put people off because if they join the armed forces, there is a real risk they might have to actually engage?
Yeah, I mean, these things are never easy to work your way through. And we have a generation that, as I said earlier, have not perceived that threat. So it's how you message this thing. It comes down to leadership at the end of the day, and influence, and if to use the word inspire people that we have a problem here and we need you to help us resolve it. I'm not one that sweepingly, says the current generation are not interested. They are interested. I mean, clearly we have issues, and there are lots of young people who are not in work, not in training, and not in education. So, part of me says that national service is not a bad thing in and of itself. We don't have a big enough professional military to take in tens of thousands of youngsters in the way that we would have done back in the 50s and 60s. We just don't have the infrastructure and the people to train them and look after them. But we have the ability to take in some. And there is a view, and I've heard people discuss it, and I'm not potentially against it, that if youngsters are not in work, educational training between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 25, they're told, okay, well, you can serve a year in the military, or you can do some national service in other parts of the nation, the social infrastructure, be that, the NHS or wherever. So I think you have to sell the message. You have to convince people that there is a problem. And I'm not convinced that we are doing that particularly well. And part of that is because people, I think, understandably say, well, hang on a second, we're not going to see the Soviet tanks or Russian tanks driving through London up to Whitehall. But we are engaged day to day today in what they call the grey zone and hybrid warfare and so on. I mean, we've just had the report of the Salisbury attack. That is part of hybrid warfare. The cyber attacks that go on every day are part of hybrid warfare. The Russians are constantly going into our exclusion zones, putting their airplanes across our airspace, putting ships down the English Channel and so forth. So there's plenty of evidence to say that Russia are being quite aggressive. But you have to be convinced that they're actually going to be prepared to fight NATO. And then you have to say, okay, how would we respond to that? And obviously the countries that are hard up against the Russian border, Poland, the Baltics, and so on, are those that probably would end up by engaging in some sort of land campaign. So what would our contribution be to that? Historically, it's been maritime, air. We would need land forces as well. But again, not like the Cold War days where we had a core of 3 armored divisions based permanently in Germany, about 60,000 strong, capable of fighting a core level operation. I can't see us, going back to those days. But you have to think that through. You then have to message it to the population and particularly to young people as to why this is necessary. The threat is serious, and we need to do something about it. And we're going to do that by various measures, including, if necessary, bringing in national service or conscription of some form.
Tim, moving this from the human and the military to the church and the spiritual, just as we round off this interview, is there a parallel to be drawn, do you think? Because here in the UK, we live at peace. We have large freedoms to follow our faith, and yet we know there are Christians in many countries of the world facing a real full-on spiritual battle for their faith. Do we need to be ready and willing to help them in their battle?
Well, my instinct is, of course, to say yes. And it's been interesting to see that, Trump, for example, has been talking about the threat to Christians in places like Nigeria. There's no doubt that, the persecution against Christians around the world is very serious. And the numbers of Christians that are living in the Middle East today, for example, is relatively tiny, small numbers compared to what it was, or not all that long ago. The question is, what do you do about it? Well, I'm not. I don't think we are in the business of putting in military forces into places like Nigeria or the Middle East or Pakistan or elsewhere where there is a real threat to Christian communities. We're not into that. So you have to do it in other ways. There are methods of that. There's diplomacy. There's through aid, and of course as Christians through prayer. It is the reality of a broken world, as we've often discussed, and it's not a nice thing to see in inverted commas. But I just don't think using military force will bring about the change. You have to win the battle of ideas in this business, and somehow we have to engage with these countries and convince them that they need to do something about it. Now, to be fair, Nigeria, is working hard in trying to sort out their problems in inverted commas, and we can help them with that, and we can help them in military sense by helping them to train their military, provide them with the necessary equipment, particularly in intelligence gathering, and in surveillance and reconnaissance and all sorts of other stuff. So there is a way of helping people to fight that battle for them and to support them in that, but I don't think it includes us putting our military actively engaging in those nations.
Major General Tim Cross, thank you for joining us today.
You're very welcome, as always. Thank you.